then there is no way I can vote for that bill when it comes back. And that needs to be said, and it needs to be clear. The fact of the matter is, our country is hanging on by a very thin fiscal thread. Bond markets are recognizing this.
Señores, ¿qué tan mal tiene que estar la situación entre Donald Trump y los republicanos como para que estemos viendo cómo entre ellos se están criticando y no solo eso, estén arremetiendo en contra del gran y hermoso proyecto de ley? Hace un momento estaba escuchando al congresista republicano Chip Roy de Texas, el cual pues en la Cámara de Representantes salió con todo en contra de este proyecto. Y dejó una frase muy, pero muy interesante que deja mucho, ¿no?, que pensar. Y es, estamos dejando en bancarrota el futuro de nuestros hijos. Quiero que escuchemos un pequeño fragmento de su intervención y luego vamos a analizarlo punto por punto. Escuchemos sus palabras.
Then there is no way I can vote for that bill when it comes back. And that needs to be said, and it needs to be clear. The fact of the matter is, our country is hanging on by a very thin fiscal thread. Bond markets are recognizing this. There was a headline in the Financial Times today. Foreign markets are starting to pull out of federal treasuries. Interest rates are doing what they're doing. You can change the Fed chairman all you want, but if you don't fix the fiscal mess we're in, the outer part of that curve, which is what sets our mortgage rates, our long-term borrowing rates, that's still going to be a mess, and the American people aren't going to be able to afford homes. The average age of the American homeowner today is as high as it's ever been. It's up about 10 years. Now you're in your upper 30s before you're buying home instead of upper 20s, which it was not long ago. We are ripping the American dream out of the hands of our kids and our grandkids because of people in this chamber and people in the other chamber who refuse to do the hard work of governing responsibly. I should say representing, we don't govern, but doing our job. You know, I am blessed to be alive. I'm a cancer survivor. Talked about that before. Was blessed to have treatment at MD Anderson, and that was, what year is this? That was 14 years ago. I think 14 years ago this next month. And why do I bring that up? Because I get cancer groups that come into my office all the time. Speaker, you get cancer groups, you get ALS groups, you get people who have a heart to solve a problem. And they want money. They want funding. I have to say no. If they don't come in and say, well, we know that we're $37 trillion in debt, so we're proposing this plan, and we're proposing cuts over here in order to achieve what we want, which is $100 million for some research. They usually don't do that. They just come in and say we need $100 million for research, or $500 million for research, or $1 billion for some program. And I have to say no. But I always say no. I tell my farmers who come in and are just dying for relief because we've messed up their livelihood so much, Congress has, with a failed system. Crop insurance is important. All the things we do is important. But we include a bloated food stamp program, which is exploding off the charts in the Farm Bill every 5 years. And they expect me to vote to continue a food stamp program, which is often going to the able-bodied, often corrupted, often feeding our children and people in this country sugary, terrible foods that are making our healthcare system more expensive. And they want me to keep paying for that. So I have to tell my farmers, sorry guys, I'm not voting for the Farm Bill. But I got to say, there's only a handful of us in this chamber who are willing to say no. No is the most powerful and important word in the English language when it is used the right way, which I would say in this body should be used most of the time.
Ok, señores. A simple vista, Chip Roy suena como el clásico patriota, ¿no? Preocupado por el futuro del país. Pero a ver amigos, primero, es cierto que Estados Unidos actualmente tiene una deuda pública gigantesca, ¿no? Pero lo que Chip Roy no menciona es que gran parte de esa deuda viene pues de decisiones fiscales impulsadas por él y por su partido. Imagino que ustedes recuerdan, ¿no? Los famosos recortes de impuestos de Trump en su primer mandato, ¿no? En lo que iba del año 2017. Bueno, pues ese paquete fue aprobado mayormente por republicanos, ¿no? Y es algo que terminó aumentando significativamente el déficit. Entonces, cuando Chip Roy dice que está en contra de gastar tanto, ¿no? Yo creo que uno se pregunta, ¿dónde estaba entonces, no? Es cierto, eso que acaba de decir es interesante, ¿no? Que pues uno, ¿por qué van a ir a gastar tanto? Pero da un poco de ironía que él lo diga. Además, su crítica hacia los programas sociales como lo es el Medicare, el SNAP, ¿no? Que creo que antes se llamaba Food Stamps, eh, también tiene ciertas matices. Sí, esos programas cuestan dinero, lógicamente, ¿no? Pero, a ver amigos, hablamos de programas que salvan millones de vidas a millones de personas, especialmente en momentos de crisis económica, como es la de este momento. Recortar estos programas sin tener que ofrecerte alternativas reales no es una reforma. Ahí es simplemente esto, dejar a la gente atrás. Luego está ese momento dramático, ¿no? Donde habla de negar financiamiento a grupos médicos porque no le presentan un plan de recorte de gastos. A ver, no es que no haya deuda, es que no pueden exigir que organizaciones sin fines de lucro resuelvan problemas estructurales del gobierno. O sea, no es su trabajo equilibrar el presupuesto, es su trabajo de él como legislador. También es interesante cómo utiliza su experiencia personal, ¿no? Con el tema del cáncer para darle este peso moral a su argumento, ¿no? Es obvio, es admirable su lucha en contra de una enfermedad, pero usar eso como justificación para no apoyar financiación médica o investigación, yo creo que eso es aprovecharse de la empatía ajena, ¿no? Para querer defender políticas duras e inflexibles. Ahora bien, sé que algunos podrían decir, pero si no controlamos el gasto público, vamos a terminar como Grecia, como Argentina, ¿no? Y sí, tienen razón en parte. No se los debato. Hay que ser responsables con el dinero público. Pero la respuesta no es cortar programas sociales. No mientras se mantienen subsidios millonarios a corporaciones, a los, al 0,01% más rico de Estados Unidos o del mundo. Y encima se sigue gastando dinero en defensa. Y sin revisión aún. ¿Dónde está la famosa auditoría al Pentágono? Chip Roy habla como si solo hubiera dos opciones, ¿no? Y es gastar sin control o recortar todo. Pero la realidad es más compleja. Se puede gobernar con responsabilidad fiscal, sin necesidad de sacrificar a los más vulnerables. Así de simple. De hecho, hay muchos economistas que han sostenido que invertir en educación, en salud, en vivienda, es una forma sostenible de poder fortalecer la economía de tu país a largo plazo. Y al parecer es el punto, ¿no?, en el que los republicanos en este momento no pueden llegar. Como podemos ver, es un caos entre ellos. Ya no saben qué quieren apoyar, si quieren apoyar los recortes, si quieren apoyar más gastos, simplemente vemos una vez más la división republicana. El caos en el movimiento MAGA. Ahora bien, señores, pasemos al siguiente tema. Y es que el día de ayer pasó algo bastante impactante para muchos, ¿no? Y fue este fallo importante en la Constitución por parte de la Corte Suprema. Ahora mismo en Estados Unidos prácticamente tus derechos constitucionales pueden llegar a depender del estado en el cual tú vivas, tal y como lo escuchan. Y todo esto es gracias a esta reciente decisión de la Corte Suprema, ¿no? Hablamos de que el país más poderoso del mundo, al parecer, tiene una constitución a medias. Y todo esto, una vez más, por culpa de un capricho autoritario de Donald Trump. La decisión de la Corte Suprema, señores, que permite que entre en vigencia en ciertos lugares una orden ejecutiva de Trump que busca eliminar el derecho a la ciudadanía por nacimiento. Amigos, además de ser inconstitucional, según todos los tribunales previos, esto va a generar un caos legal terrible en el país. La jueza Sonia Sotomayor no se quedó callada y ha lanzado dura crítica muy feroz que dejó en evidencia la gravedad de este fallo. Escuchemos esta noticia.
So, Paul, as Vaughn just mentioned, there's that 30-day window, so his executive order doesn't automatically go into effect in certain jurisdictions or certain states, right? Do you think the Supreme Court's going to weigh in within the next 30 days on the merits?
It certainly won't. What it's waiting is for the cases about the substantive issue of birthright citizenship to work their way through the system. So first through the district courts and then through the Court of Appeals and finally to the Supreme Court. So that is not likely to happen until next Supreme Court term at the earliest. And so Justice Sotomayor, in her blistering dissent in this case, said that we now have a system where some people have constitutional rights and others don't. We have this patchwork constitution, which Justice Sotomayor says undermines the rule of law in the United States. This isn't only about the crucial issue of birthright citizenship, but because of federal injunctions, now the Trump administration has been prevented from deporting hundreds of thousands of immigrants. It's been prevented from forcing transgendered women prisoners to be housed with male inmates. It's been prevented from withholding funds from schools that practice diversity. Now, all of those protections go out of the window unless somehow in the next 30 days, all of those litigants can get into the 94 district courts in the United States, get lawyers, and try to get injunctions in those individual courts.
Danny, I see you nodding along. I mean, I guess on this one issue specifically, does it sound like Trump's executive order banning birthright citizenship is going to go into effect, at least in certain parts of the country?
Temporarily, yes, with the idea being, as the Solicitor General argued, that all of these cases, as Paul pointed out, will have to percolate. That was the magic word they used at oral argument. They percolate through the system and make their way up to the Supreme Court. But I have to say that in her blistering dissent, Sotomayor has some pretty good points. Among them are the idea that, yes, one of the things the majority ignored was that the administration lost at every single level, at the district court, at the Court of Appeals. And that's significant to Sotomayor. To the majority, it isn't as important. But the reason it's significant is that this is an example where the forecast is that this executive order will probably be unconstitutional. Why? Because we have a case history. Now, true, the Supreme Court will look at the issue with fresh eyes because it's such a pure legal issue of first impression, but the fact that they've lost at every level is a strong argument for a nationwide injunction, for enjoining the administration itself. You enjoin the administration from doing what it's doing everywhere as opposed to in one of 94 districts. And so folks understand...
Couldn't the Supreme Court have done that in this case? Couldn't they have said on this issue, this nationwide injunction makes sense? We are marking that right now at this high level, and wouldn't that have provided clarity for a lot of people, for the country of millions who are going to be impacted?
Yes, if the dissenters had the majority. But yes, here's one way they could have done it. The majority's rationale is that the idea of an injunction is limited by the Judiciary Act. And so you have to go back 200 years to the 1700s and say, hey, were courts in England enjoining people who are not actual parties before the court? And the majority concludes, no, they did not. You have to have the actual parties before the court. So you can't issue a nationwide injunction because someone in Oklahoma isn't before the court. Someone in Oregon isn't before the court. Therefore, the courts don't have the power to enjoin this activity. But even the majority acknowledges that this concept, it's called equity, the idea of injunctions, is a flexible concept. So if it is flexible, arguably it could have gone the other way, and a nationwide injunction could arguably be constitutional. That's just one way this could have gone in the direction of the dissenters. But the reality is the dissenters are the minority, the predictable three-person minority.
Can I jump in for a second? You know, there is a universe in which there still could be a universal injunction in this case, and it's something that the court discusses with respect to the states. What they say is when the states asked for their universal injunctions, they said it wouldn't be enough just to give them relief in their respective states because their residents could migrate between states, that unless there was something that covered the entire landscape of the country, the states that were litigating here, could not get completely relief. And I want to read from Justice Barrett's majority decision, because while she doesn't agree with that per se, she doesn't shut down the executive order wholesale, she leaves that question for another day. She says, we decline to take up these arguments in the first instance. The lower court should determine whether a narrower injunction is appropriate, meaning vis-a-vis the individual states. We therefore leave it to them to consider these and any related arguments. But before she gets there, Anna, she is talking about what those arguments are that the states make. She says, as the states see it, their harms, financial injuries, and administrative burdens flowing from citizen-dependent benefits programs, meaning you have to be a citizen to qualify, cannot be remedied without a blanket ban on the enforcement of the executive order. And then she goes and talks about how the administration says that's not right. You could only apply them to those respective states. She says, you know what? We're not deciding that right now. The lower court should consider both sides of this argument when we throw it back to them. Again, in her dissent, Justice Jackson is saying they even concede that there are some circumstances in this particular case where a universal injunction still might be appropriate. They won't give it to them now, but we could come back to a situation where one of the district courts involved in the state litigation says, even with this decision in hand, I still find a universal injunction is entirely appropriate, and then it goes back to the Supreme Court again.
Again, this was a 6-3 decision, so it broke along kind of party lines. I know that's not the technical term that you use with the Supreme Court, but you have the conservative justices and you have the liberal justices. Amy Coney Barrett wrote the majority opinion, and she said this about nationwide injunctions, quote, the bottom line, the universal injunction was conspicuously non-existent for most of our nation's history. Because the universal injunction lacks a historical pedigree, it falls outside the bounds of a federal court's equitable authority. Paul, what kind of territory are we in when it comes to checks and balances?
We're in brand new territory where the Supreme Court doesn't seem up to exercising its role as a co-equal branch of government. It's letting the Trump administration get away with things it's hard to believe it will let any other administration get away with. You know, the executive branch has always had the power to issue executive orders, but what's new is the level and scope of what the Trump administration is doing. It's making all of these sweeping holdings that federal courts in all of the birthright citizen cases so far have conceded are probably unconstitutional, but at least for the short term or perhaps the long term, depending on when the court decides to rule on the merits, some people in some states have constitutional rights that people in other states don't.
Yeah, I was just looking for what the lower court said here, Danny, because he's absolutely right that the lower courts all have ruled against the Trump administration's executive order on the merits. Given that this court is not ruling on the merits yet and is allowing the birthright citizenship ban to go into effect in some places, practically speaking, even if it is just temporarily, does that give us any clues as to how this court would rule on the merits?
This is a main focus of Sotomayor's dissent, which is we should take into consideration the fact that the administration has lost at every level. Now, the counter to that argument is that in cases like this, especially cases of first impression on constitutional issues that have rarely, if ever, been decided, there's an argument to be made that every single decision is basically an exhibition match. And that's because the Supreme Court eventually, and actually the appellate court, looks at every one of these legal issues with fresh eyes. So they're not really as bound as they might be with issues of fact, which are usually etched in stone at the trial court level. So there is the counter to that argument, which is, well, maybe it doesn't matter as much that the Trump administration has lost at every level because they could always win at the Supreme Court. But Sotomayor makes a compelling point that it should factor in. This is a great example of something that the government is so likely to lose on. And one of the other things I thought she raised that I thought was important was Think about this going the other way. What if the next president, a Democrat president, for example, says, I hereby issue an executive order, we're collecting all the guns. We're collecting them all tomorrow.
Right.
We're going house to house, and we interpret the Constitution. The Second Amendment is saying, well, we're only talking about militia, and that's, I don't know, the National Guard. Therefore, your AR-15 is now going to be collected by our authorities. Imagine the same thing. Someone would immediately go to a district court to challenge that as unconstitutional. And so now, what does this mean? That we now need to wait for, as Attorney General Solicitor General Sauer said, for these cases to percolate up through the system. Well, we can't do that. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander, is what Sotomayor points out in her dissent.
I mean, Danny brings up a great point, Paul. I mean, the next administration could be a Democratic administration. They may have certain issues that they want to push through, certain policies, and instead of going the legislative route, which oftentimes gets super, super bogged down, those administrations could just issue executive orders now, right? And they could, in effect, go into effect in parts of the country, if not the entire country, as long as their policy is not challenged by lawsuits in every single district court.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So as a formal matter, this opinion will apply to Democratic administrations and presidents as well as Republicans. And President Obama famously brought a bunch of executive orders that the Republicans didn't like. And to the extent that they were unconstitutional, they would now only, at least in the short term, be unconstitutional in one of the 94 districts where the person brought the lawsuit. So what the Supreme Court suggests in this opinion might be a way to resolve the patchwork quilt of rights that this decision creates is through class action lawsuits. Well, guess what? This court has been very busy limiting the right of people to bring class action. You have to be certified. The judge has to approve a number of issues. So it's difficult, especially in this case, the people who are likely plaintiffs, parents who are expecting a baby. Do we really expect them to run to court, get a bunch of other people to agree with them, and that's the only way that they can have the same rights?
Y es que, amigos, lo que acabamos de escuchar honestamente es escalofriante. La jueza Sotomayor lo ha dejado muy en claro. Esto es una burla solemne a nuestra Constitución, y tiene muchísima razón. Esto no es un simple debate legal sobre tecnicismo judicial. Aquí ya estamos viendo una alerta roja sobre el rumbo por el cual está tomando el sistema judicial en Estados Unidos bajo la presión del trumpismo. Donald Trump, con este intento de eliminar la ciudadanía por nacimiento, está atacando uno de los pilares más fundamentales en la democracia estadounidense, amigos. Hablamos de la igualdad de los derechos constitucionales para todos, sin importar el estado en el cual tú nazcas o en el cual tú vivas. Pero lo más alarmante es que lo hace mediante una orden ejecutiva. O sea, no quiere ni pasar por el Congreso, no quiere tener un debate democrático, no quiere ser legítimo. Aunque todos los tribunales inferiores, y sí señores, todos, fallaron en su contra, la Corte Suprema no solo decidió ignorarlo, sino que además permitió que su orden entre parcialmente en vigor. Ahora bien, comprendiendo esto, ¿qué significa? Que si tú vives en un estado con un juez que esté dispuesto a emitir una orden judicial, quizás tengas aún protección. Pero si estás en otro lugar, te fregaste. Literalmente, ahora hay personas que tienen derechos constitucionales plenos y otras que no. Y esto varía dependiendo de tu código postal. O sea, la mayoría conservadora del tribunal, ¿no? Que, por ejemplo, liderada por Amy Coney, ¿no? Hablamos de que es gente que se escondió detrás del tecnicismo legal de hace cuántos siglos, solo para justificarte no querer emitirte una orden judicial nacional. Pero bueno, como bien nos señalan, ¿no? Esta corte ha limitado sistemáticamente las acciones colectivas y ahora pues tampoco permite protecciones nacionales. Así que, ¿qué opción queda para defenderse? Que una mujer embarazada en Texas tenga que armar una demanda colectiva en tiempo récord para evitar que su hijo nazca sin ciudadanía es ridículo. Y sí, amigos, tal vez algunos puedan decir, bueno, Esto afectará a todos los presidentes, también a todos los demócratas. Seamos honestos, señores. ¿Quién ha usado las órdenes ejecutivas con tanto descaro como una herramienta para imponer una agenda radical como Trump? ¿De verdad creen que esta misma corte conservadora va a dejar pasar una orden demócrata, una que intente, por ejemplo, regular armas? Yo creo que ya sabemos cuál es la respuesta. Como lo dije hace un momento, no es un debate judicial. Es una alerta, es una advertencia sobre el poder, sobre los límites. Se están rompiendo. Hablamos de la fragilidad de los derechos cuando el autoritarismo se disfraza de legalidad. Hoy es la ciudadanía por nacimiento, ¿no? ¿Y mañana qué será? Bueno, pues los invito a que me dejen sus opiniones en la caja de comentarios. ¿Creen que esta decisión es una amenaza real a los derechos constitucionales? Tal vez piensan que la Corte solo está siguiendo el procedimiento legal. ¿Será que la Corte Suprema está ya tan vendida? Pues bueno, los invito a que me dejen sus opiniones en la caja de comentarios. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarme hasta el final de este video. Recuerden, como siempre, dale like, comparte nuestro contenido y suscríbete a nuestro canal. Políticamente en Desacuerdo. Nos vemos en el próximo video. Hasta luego.